We have just wrapped season 2.
We have. Feels a little bit surreal.
Yeah.
Well, people are going to listen to another group conversation.
Yeah.
What's your initial feeling, reaction? You
So
look
it
like
it
you're
is
thinking and feeling something.
well, yeah, I am thinking and feeling something. It it is lovely to hear, kind of to be mirrored, or it makes me feel seen and heard, that what I experience in these conversations, which is long form, meandering, deep conversations of honesty and vulnerability, where there isn't an agenda and where we are allowed to speak our mind, however certain or uncertain that thought might be. Um, and that it isn't just me experiencing that, it is, in this case, Andy and Matthew and Izzy too. And that he's like, I can kind of see this energy ball of chi bouncing off from Matthew into Andy, and it's like it just goes on where it is. We have had we have had this type of group conversation now with everybody from season 1 and everybody from season 2, so that's 11 people. And everyone has shared that same type of experience, that same type of worth, which, you know, it is it is it is a lovely thing to be a part of and to enable, in a sense. Matthew speaks about emergence and about what wants to happen, and I think this podcast is a very good example of what wants to happen, even though it took some time before it actually did happen. But once it did, it really did, you know?
It sure did. Yeah, I think it's amazing how all of these people and everyone that I've been speaking to who've listened to the podcast as well, they're all expressing the same joy over genuine meandering conversations. And I mean that was the intention from you when you started this. So I think it's both a great achievement for you, but I also think it's a really nice sentiment
Hmm.
that everyone wants and needs more of these conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's let people get on with listening to us.
Sure thing. Enjoy.
Well, I'm so happy to have you all here. For this will be the final recording for the second season of Tankespjärn with Helena Roth. I just realized I took a walk before to gather my thoughts and just, wow, that's where we're at. So I leave it up to Caspian because he's to chaperone us for this time.
Well, and adding to that, I should before starting, um, you're publishing the 52nd episode of the podcast this Tuesday. No, 50th.
No,
Sorry.
50th. The
Yeah, sorry, my
50th.
bad. So we're soon at 1 year.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool as well.
Yeah.
Been doing this for quite some time now.
Yeah.
So well, I guess welcome. It's a bit strange saying that since I'm the last one in the room, but yet welcome. Um, what I want us to speak a bit about today is the experience around being on this podcast, because I know it's I don't want to say different than any other podcasts, but it is. And I think it's a format that um, is well suited for some reflection afterwards, saying that you all have had 5 conversations with Helena. They've all been in the same sort of manner, but on very different topics and in very different ways, I would say. And so that's what I want us to do today, to sort of reflect on what these conversations have done to you, with you, for you, um, and sort of sum up the 5 conversations that you each had with Helena, and the 25 conversations for you, Helena. Um, is that right? 25? No, 15.
No, 25. I did 25.
In total,
Yeah,
Five
you did
times
25
five.
for
but
the full season. Yeah.
yeah.
So what I want to start out with really is the sort of the intention, the going into the series. When Helena asked you to be on the podcast, what was your what were your thoughts, your feelings, your sort of preconceived ideas, your worries, if you had any, sort of what were you going into the season with?
Mm. Can I go first?
Sure.
Well, for me, it was a bit weird to be on the other side because I do the podcast as well, I have guests and I interview them. I ask the questions and, I steer the conversation often the direction that I would like to take it. But so then Helen asked me to do the 5 conversations. And at first I thought 5, well, it's quite a bit, but it's a practice. So I'm like, hell yeah, I will do it because it's first time when I was a guest on another person podcast. So I was like, yeah, why not? And I remember I asked Helena to limit this up to 1 hour because I know that I probably would get I know my brain, just the energy goes down after 60 minutes of talking. Um, but yeah, it was very exciting, and actually having 5 conversations wasn't that much. It didn't feel like it's a lot because they were spread over a certain period of time. And they were really like mind opening conversation. It was cool for me to talk to a different person about the topics that I feel comfortable talking about, and having someone else's perspective on it. So that was great. But yeah, it was a challenge for me because being on this other side, that just was different for me. And it's first time when I did it, Helena, so I think it was a great run for me for being guest on someone else's podcast. And first time was like, I was nervous first time, like first conversation, despite the fact that we spoke before, we had some conversations, we exchanged, I think, some emails and everything. But first conversation, first recording, I was nervous. And then the more we did, I think the better it went, and sometimes I was wondering, what are we going to talk about? But the conversation just happened. So, and that was really, really great. And I think Helena are doing a great job. You just naturally able to move from one topic to another topic, and you don't have any script or anything. It happens, which is fantastic, I think.
Yeah, I concur. Yeah, for me it was because I spoke to Helena on my podcast, so I had a feel for the conversation before I kind of agreed to do this. And when you asked Helena, it was like a no-brainer, because there's something about just that meandering slow vibe that really appeals to me in terms of just diving into topics over time and letting those conversations flow. And I think, I know it's one of your values, really, isn't it? To like there's so much more to say than you can fit into like a 30-minute, 45-minute episode. And that was, just really freeing to not feel like I've got to fit everything that I might want to say into this one kind of period of time. And then to reflect between episodes and that kind of thing as well was just really freeing. So it's a lovely format. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was interesting for me in being only the second time I had appeared on a podcast. I was a guest on a podcast in 2020 as I was in the process of creating a podcast, which never quite came to fruition, but I was wanting to be in the position of a podcast guest as a podcast creator to give myself a sort of fuller perspective on what I was inviting people into. But then I had been in conversation when I came to this podcast. I came with Emma, first of all, and so it wasn't just me, and I knew both of the other people. So, and not only that, but there's been an ongoing conversation between me and Helena, between Emma and I, between all three of us, in various settings over the past couple of years. And my nervousness actually was that I would forget we were recording and that this was going to be public, and that I would, say something that I would, rather only have said in private or something, because typically that's, our conversations have been in private spaces. And so, so I had some nervousness about that, knowing that I can get sort of carried away by a topic and into a conversation in such a way that my presence of mind may be somewhat less in terms of remaining aware that the recording is ongoing. But it was wonderful, and both in terms of the length of an individual recording and in terms of the succession of episodes. These were 5 conversations we had, and for me, I have over the past couple of years been sort of recovering from a lengthy period of social isolation. And ironically, this was the pandemic that allowed this to happen for me, in suddenly going from a geographical in-place context to this virtual online context, and suddenly meeting a whole lot of new people and developing new relationships, and finding my way into new collective settings, communities, forums, etc. And so, I've done these, like, people will have 30-minute Zoom calls or they'll meet for an hour. And I feel very fortunate to have sort of um, get to know a lot of people who are more inclined towards 2-hour Zoom meetings or Zoom calls. Because for me, there's a real, it's like if you'd been fasting for 10 years, you might eat, when you started eating again, you might eat more than you had before that 10-year period for a period of time. And I feel like I'm kind of reconstituting myself socially. So to have not just that duration in terms of quantity, but in terms of depth, in terms of these sort of less tangible aspects of it, it's been really soothing, healing, and just really enjoyable.
It's so nice. Helena, do you have anything to add going into the season? Were you? Because
Well,
this time, just for both for the listeners and for all of you here, the first season were all people you already knew quite well, weren't
Yeah.
they?
Yeah.
And this season you branched out a little bit.
I branched out a little bit. I thought that this season would be trios, that all of the 5s would be trios. Matthew and Enma were the first that I asked. And when you said yes, it was like, oh, but that's not how it turned out to be. You turned out to be the only trio. I then asked Andy, Uh, whom I know Andy, thanks to you, Caspia, because you were Googling for people on Instagram and stuff that I might enjoy, and you found a piece on doing gentle that Andy had written. You said, here's somebody I think you would like. And I'd reached out to you on Twitter, and he was like, yeah, I did like you. We had a conversation, and then we recorded for your podcast, and yeah, he's one. And then it just kind of, fell into place in the way that it does. Izzy, I had a conversation with Izzy because Matthew connected us on Forward Link, which was the Akimbo Workshops discourse forum that is now out of use. And we had a conversation, just a get to know each other conversation. And by the end of it, I asked if you wanted to join. Reddy, I met on Twitter, and 24 hours later, we were recording the first conversation. So, you know, and then there's Steve, who is also along with me, Matthew, and in the creative community. So it's a mix, and it's a mix that I kind of enjoy having that mix. I kind of enjoy having this diversity of people where I know what Matthew and Inma do for a living. I know, I know their history and their background and stuff. Reddy, I still don't know. It's like I still don't really know what he does for a living, and I like that, and I actually like that I still don't really know what it is that he does every day. But what I do get to see of what he does, I really love and enjoy. So there's this like sense of exploration and adventure somehow.
Mm. And well, sort of um, with that approach in mind, I mean, you reached out to Andy and Reddy via Twitter. You got Izzy via Matthew. With that approach, what did you expect? Anything else from this season than from the first?
No, not really. Because not really, because my expectations isn't really an expectation. It is kind of more a knowing that these are people who have accepted the premise, which is to come and to be. And that's kind of it. And if you're not, and I have spoken to everybody. I had spoken for 30 minutes to Reddy before asking him. So there's this sense in me that if they say yes, then they kind of know what they're going, what they're saying yes to. And that I'm not asking for anything else. It is just just with bunny ears. It is the conversation that I'm after. It is that connection that I'm after.
I think that's felt really refreshing to me as well, that it's a holistic sense of like everything sort of fits together, as opposed to it feeling like, from my perspective, you're doing this for some sort of, as a marketing thing, or like, with another agenda in mind. It feels really authentic, and just actually it's the conversations that's what matters, and that comes through in spades. So
And then sort of moving into the conversations, and this is for all of you. What did you've all sort of touched on it already, but what did you feel, think, experience throughout the conversations? Having these, 1 hour to I think the longest of these were probably Matthew and in mode 2.5 hour conversations. Sort of having them on a regular basis, what was that like?
It was something I looked forward to greatly. Even even though I have typically been in conversation with either Helena or Emma or both on a weekly or every other week basis, for months now. Um, there's something about having this particular space available for. Um, it's interesting because it's actually it's touching in an interesting way, and that it was it felt it was just a very hospitable sort of thing. It was like there was I was invited, um, and 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 Emma was invited, and so there was something, and that there wasn't anything in particular I needed to bring, but just who I am and how I respond to whatever comes up. Um, and it's not that that contrasts so greatly with other spaces that I'm in for conversations, like where this conversation that I was already having with Helena and Emma were happening. But there was typically a focus, and it wasn't like about me. Not that it always needs to be about me, but that this is something, and it was fairly subtle, perhaps even, but um, I felt very seen and welcomed specifically as myself. And I think that for me, that has meaning because it's actually, and I'm grateful for the question, because this has not come up for me in my awareness until hearing the question. Um, but that's actually a major deficiency in my entire life um, is having space where who I actually am is welcome. And it's not even there's even more nuance to it than that, because there is this sense that who I am is emerging always. That who I am is not a fixed quantity or defined um, in any fixed way. And so who I am depends on who I'm with, depends on where I am, depends on what's happening. Um, and to be able to show up and participate in a conversation without any constraint on who I am, other than social convention or whatever that I um, that's that's something new in my life in the past couple of years, and it feels particularly um, salient in this context for me.
I really like what you said, Matthew, about like showing up without any constraint, because it truly felt like this to like come to the conversation and just having an honest conversation with Helena, and I just didn't feel in any way judged, or like it was just having an open-minded conversation, and that was very freeing. And yeah, I felt welcomed each time I came there. And first time I was quite nervous, but later I knew, like, I knew what I can expect, though it was quite unexpected, because each conversation, there was no like script for the conversation. There were no questions set up before. We just had a conversation on things that has happened in our life recently, about challenges in life, about good things that were happening to us. And the fact that you can have a conversation with another human being on like not on a shallow level, but really deep and honest conversation is really, really cool. And I think a lot of people should benefit from this, because we often have the conversation just on the surface, and we don't have energy, we don't have willingness to just dive deeper. And that's a shame, I think, because we can learn a lot from each other, and like just to come into conversation with open mind and being curious, that's already a big thing. And I think Helena just nailed it, because this is what she does in each conversation. She's just curious. She just wants to, she strives for those conversations, for those honest and deep conversations. And this is really cool. And I think that's something that I learned also from Helena, like to when I speak with my guests, to not only stick with the questions, yeah, sure, I have some, but just to have to help them to relax, to have an honest conversation. And the other thing is that, I don't know, like 2 years ago, I had the experience with Alt MBA, and for me, that was just awesome. I met a lot of open-minded people with whom I could have really, really great conversations. And then when Alt MBA finished, then it was like, okay, well, you kind of need to create your own tribe, people with whom you can talk. And then through Matthew, through Forward Link, I met Helena, and instantly I had that feeling that, well, it will be this little part of Alt MBA. Those conversations will be a reminder for me of what I had in Alt MBA. So that was instantly something that I was excited about.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's really interesting just hearing that sort of it's the beingness is really coming through in terms of what everybody values in these conversations is the being and not the doing necessarily. And like Matthew, you're saying, just being seen. And I guess it's the compassion that comes through of just showing up as you are, and whatever happens in terms of the conversation. And that's part of what I really loved and looked forward to throughout the whole 5 recordings, was just knowing that, I mean, after each conversation, it sparked all sorts of ideas and connected all sorts of things for me that then I was like, right, go away and sort of write and explore certain things that have come up. And it was just linking things together. And it really showed the power of, like, I guess, non-agenda based conversation in terms of being part of my creative process. And part of the, just, I guess, surrendering control and trusting that actually great stuff's going to come from this. You don't know what that's going to be, but I absolutely love that. And I love the fact that, you were saying, Helena, about not knowing what people do for a living. And actually that's a real core part of that beingness as well, in terms of these conversations being reflective of, like, I guess, what people are thinking about, what people are exploring. And actually, what you do for a living might be secondary, like, to all of that stuff. And the things that are of value in our lives and the things that we want to talk about are kind of, they might be that, but they might well be something else as well. So just love it.
And it's been so interesting. It is you and me, Andy. Our 5th conversation is the one that will be released on Tuesday, when we are recording this on April 3rd. And I have been following you on Twitter these past few days, seeing how what we were speaking about has blossomed into blog posts and thoughts and questions in you. And it's like, it is not as if the strata, the growth strata for those ideas comes from our conversation. It is that, like you say, things sort of comes, and then it's like they interlink and interwove or weaved or somehow, and have now, like, gone on to become blog posts or whatever they turn into, so that it is this kind of snapshot image, in a sense, of what happens when you see how everything is interlinked, how it does come together, how one thing feeds another, that feeds a third, that all of a sudden sparks something in Izzy's life, Um, so it's a lovely It's a lovely reminder of the interconnectedness of our being. How we all like bounce off each other and kind of, give a little bit of pollen and receive a little bit of pollen, and then we bumblebee on, you know. Uh, I love that.
So, and it's, I think one of the things that I valued is, start exploring an idea, definitely not in any way fully formed, and feeling safe to do that. Like there's been safety for that. And then getting, I don't know what the right term would be. Pushback is the term in my head, but it's not sort of a strong hostile pushback. It's a gentle sort of ebbing and flowing sort of pushback from you, and like it's almost a whittling of ideas in that sense, to get to a place of like, oh yeah, not thought about it quite like that. Maybe that's something to explore. And just, those conversations just feel like that sort of a weird fluid molding of certain things. So,
And I've been listening to a couple of Swedish podcasts, and in a couple of them, what's come up is this fact of how the wind helps to shape a tree, but also to strengthen a tree. And Matthew is nodding, so it might have been some English podcasts too. But if you have a big greenhouse and you have a tree inside a big greenhouse, and all of a sudden this tree is so big that it can't remain in the greenhouse, and you have to take the greenhouse away, that tree will not stand wind because it hasn't gotten that gentle pushback. It hasn't been allowed to strengthen itself and to grow into something that can kind of hold its own in the world. Yes, it can in the sheltered arena of a greenhouse, but take that away and down it goes. So that's a little bit what it does feel like to do these things. I mean, I posted a blog the other day, which is actually the first blog since January 1st, on violence, sparked by me already having the conversation in episode 49 about violence being bad, or violence maybe not being so bad. And it is the same thing. I can see how this is something I've been speaking about with Reddy. I've been speaking about it with Dominic. I've been speaking about it with Caspian. I've been speaking about it with my three wives, and how it's like, oh yeah, now it came into fruition as this actually formed blog post that in no way is the end of my thinking, because I sent it to Dominic and he sent me a gazillion links back, and just woof. All of a sudden I have all of these new like little paths to follow to see what will then happen. Yeah, it's an organic entity, this thing called life, I think.
Yeah, there's this sense of nurturing that comes to mind for me in terms of the space itself being nurturing, and Helena, you hosting it being nurturing also. In that's what I associate, talking about the sort of safety that's available to let something that's not fully formed come into the light, essentially. And so I think it's like a necessary part of growth, but maybe it's something we don't always have as much access to as we'd like to have. That's a kind of thing that can exist within particular relationships, particular settings. And for me, in this case, it's both of those things. And this is a relational setting in the first place, but that to be able to just let the ideas come, I've been really focused on this notion of emergence, of finding out what wants to happen. So not being not seeking to be any sort of a prime mover, or direct or steer anything, or make something happen, but rather to be with what is arising in my life, in the world, in a conversation, etc. this space has been particularly amenable to that process, which is what that safety is what's required for that to happen, I think, effectively.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and I think, yeah, sorry,
so,
go.
I just had a thought because, like when I compared these conversations to Alt MBA, and these conversations were limited by the amount that we had, like 5 conversations, and Alt MBA it was 1 month, yes. And we kind of got uh, used to each other. We got used to this environment, to people there, to be able to talk to everyone honestly and have these deep conversations. And then in the end, we were asked a question: how are we going to maintain this after Alt MBA is finished? And now I just thought, because for each of us, these conversations were having what seems like a positive influence. They um, pushed us in some way, in a positive way, pushed uh, to create new things, to think about some topics or some things in depth. And now I just wonder how, I didn't think about this before, but how we can sustain to have those conversations, perhaps even with other people, not only to like be attached to Helena. Not a bad idea, but I think you may have limited time. But just to have those conversations with others in different situations, to kind of get out of this comforting environment, to perhaps help others to create this environment for themselves and help them to grow in some way. Maybe that's, I don't know if that's the right description, but I think everyone gets what I mean. Everyone gets what I mean.
Which is one of the things that came up when we had this conversation after the first season. This, is like, okay, who do I want to have 5 conversations with? Who can I, and who, maybe there's 5 people that I want to have 5 conversations with, but you can start with 1. But, to actually think about that, and, it might just be that, okay, I want to have 5 conversations with my father.
Mm.
Or my brother, or the neighbor, or my boss, or, my childhood teacher, or whatever it might be, that there's I that's a little bit of a wish. I don't know that any of the people from season 1 has like deliberately set out to do a 5 times 5 convo season of their own, but I hope it's there percolating. Um and that for me is what you're speaking to, Izzy. It's like, oh yeah, what
Yeah.
how can I allow more people to experience this thing of just being in such a nurturing space, to use your term,
Yeah.
Matthew.
Because I think we talked about this, Helena, in one of the episodes, that we, and as I said in the beginning, we don't have often this deep, honest conversations, the nurturing conversation. We don't hold a space for another person where they can have an honest conversation with us. Yes, we just tend to surf on the surface, and then and that's it, and we just forgot about the people, forgot about their story or what they talk about. And I think it's important, like, it's important to hold a space for others to have this kind of conversations. And I'm not saying that, let's everyone set up for a podcast, invite people for 5 conversations. But as you said, Helena, maybe to talk with your father or with your brother or some friend from childhood, or even, I don't know, randomly met people. Sometimes maybe that's possible also.
This is something I'm interested in terms of a potential in the podcasting medium. And it occurs to me, this is something that actually came up in one of the 5 conversations I was a part of, in terms of having a conversation, and in terms of the kind of conversations that we can have. and that there is a way. Um, th- I think the potential that I'm thinking of maybe has to do with the potential for modeling a kind of conversation, for modeling a kind of relationship, because the two are intertwined. And I don't, that's something that, I talked about with Helena and Emma in one of these episodes. And I don't know if we mentioned this particular example or not. We may well have, but I was influenced really before podcasting became a thing. And these recordings date back to the 90s, before the internet was much of a thing. Maybe the late 80s, actually. But Rupert Sheldrake, Ralph Abraham, and Terence McKenna did a series of public conversations. And they were all three friends and all three scholars, but from very different fields and very different opinions about a number of things. And so they would get on a stage and have a conversation and record it, and then make the recordings available. There was a book made of the sort of selected transcripts. And for me, it was really powerful to hear these friends who were not, it wasn't that they were showing up as friends on stage necessarily. It's clear they would talk about their friendships on stage, um, but they were also showing up as, Ralph Abraham is one of the creators of chaos theory in mathematics. Rupert Sheldrake is a sort of ostracized biologist from England, and Terence McKenna is this, psychonaut of a sort. And they agree about a lot of things, but they disagree about a lot of things. And the way that they were able to have these passionate, engaged, and friendly conversations in which they modeled a kind of disagreement, and which makes me think of what you were saying, Andy, in terms of like, maybe pushback's not the right word, but there is something like the way trees need wind, that there's something, it's a supportive resistance, we could say. I mean, resistance is a necessary experience for growth. If there's not resistance, you don't get healthy growth. And so, but I think of the podcast space, and particularly how you're using it, Helena, in terms of hosting these kinds of conversations, that opens this nurturing space for emergent conversation, for ideas that maybe haven't been formed into sentences before to appear, and for people to feel safe enough to try something out I know most of the time when I'm speaking, I don't know how I'm going to finish my sentence. I might have a general sense of what the idea is, but increasingly I find I speak to discover. And so that there is a certain kind of space that's required for that. I can't, there's some spaces I wouldn't do that in. I'm no longer on Facebook, in part because of that sort of a culture. And so, but yeah, I feel it's exciting to me to consider that this is a sort of exploration of a particular potentially in podcasting for modeling conversation, but also more broadly relationship, and not just any particular kind of relationship, but to have or maybe a particular kind of relationship in terms of having discourse with people that you are friendly with and can be congenial with, and also not necessarily agree.
Yeah, I think that's super a good point. Because it's sometimes hard to have a conversations. Like, if people don't agree with you, it's hard to have an open-minded conversation. And I think it would be great if we are able to do it. Yeah, that's awesome. And you said something that I had in my head, and now I speak to discover. That's awesome. I love that.
Yeah, I love this. There's two words that come to my mind, which are practice and conditions. And I've been thinking quite a lot about conditions, kind of nurturing conditions for certain things, quite a lot. So think about it in relation to creativity. So in establishing a creative practice, it's nurturing the conditions for creativity to flourish. And I would just, hearing talk about conversations, and it could be a podcast, or it could be I'm going to commit to having 5 conversations with my father or with whoever. Actually creating the conditions for conversation to occur is something that could be really interesting to think about, because in a, we have such a mad rush world, everything's sort of instant, and the conditions for that kind of, especially slow meandering conversations, are not very present very often. And I mean, I've had the fortunate experience kind of recently of being fairly transient in where I'm living. So I'm doing quite a bit of travel and spending time staying with other people and with friends and things. And what I've realized is that there's an abundance of that sort of conversation happening when I'm in the right place for it. And when you're just sort of, it's all in the in-between moments as well. And just hanging out with people, and the conversation, it might start like a little 5-minute thing, and then you make another cup of tea and sit down and go deep. And actually there's not a lot of space for that kind of thing in a lot of life, and you've got to be fairly intentional about just creating the conditions, and not even necessarily creating the moment. It's just creating the conditions for the moment to maybe arise. And the other thing is the practice is like which is what the very kind of being specific and having boundaries around it. Like, okay, we're going to have 5 conversations. That becomes a practice. That becomes a thing that you can rely on as a rhythm, as a thing that you're plugging into. And so, yeah, those 2 things seem to be, I don't know, coming through there. So.
Yeah, I think, like we rush with so many things. We just don't, like we are not used to ask questions. We are great with giving opinions, but I think we are not curious enough to ask questions and wait for an answer and let that answer to happen, and sometimes it would be good to, I guess, if we hold our opinions and see what others will come up with. Because, as you said, Matthew, speak to discover, ask questions and see what this will bring. And the fact that someone may have a different point of view, well, that's not necessarily bad. That's actually more interesting, because I think if we would talk with people that have only the same point of view, oh, just then boring. Everyone would just agree with you, say, yes, yes, that's awesome, you're right. And we wouldn't learn anything new. And I think the beauty of the conversation is that an ability to ask questions and put time into this deep and honest conversation is that you discover new things, new ways of thinking. It sparks ideas, or maybe just soothes. I think soothing is the right word. Well, it makes you feel more in place, more like you enjoy the moment without rushing, because we rush a lot. We rush. We want everything now, and we have certain goals in head. We want to achieve it, and we don't enjoy the journey, the path that leads us to that goal. But I think that's more important. And during that path, the conversation, there is ability for those conversations.
And it's a hope for me too, I think, that having this type of conversation with someone else, I don't know what's the hen and what's the egg, but it can also mean that you're more open to having this type of conversation with yourself too. So that it's like, oh, okay, yeah, I can do this. I can say shit to Reddy that, should I really say this? And he doesn't kill me. He doesn't laugh at me, say that I'm stupid. It's like, okay, so I can say that to myself too. I can have an honest conversation with myself too, because maybe I don't have to kill myself or laugh at myself or, shut myself down. So there's this opening to have more of that type of communication with myself also. Um,
Well, I think that then also keeps going. I think that that's like a revolving door, because people who think, if you think about people who hate themselves, consider how they treat others. Right. And that's just sort of an extreme example, but the point being that the more you are able to speak to be that way with yourself, to hold that space for yourself, that then it automatically extends to within the context of your relationships with others. And I see this as actually like there's a lot of I feel like there's a potential for culture to emerge in this way, for culture to shift, and that the kind of conversation we're describing is intrinsic to it is this holding space for others, and without or withholding judgment, right? So that it's not um, I'm not um, you're free to say the wrong thing, right? And that is really key, because if you're not free to say the wrong thing, it's not safe to speak.
Mm.
And that's to me, that's what cancel culture is. That if it's a you can't speak unless you're going to say the right thing. And if I don't know what I'm going to say, how can I possibly speak? Because there are people poised to tell me I'm saying the wrong thing and cut me out of the conversation. And so um, the way that I think that everyone to a certain extent speaks to discover, and that as things change, what do? You need to talk to somebody about it, right? Whether it's something in your life, and so you talk to a close friend, or it's something in the world and you talk to the cashier and the post person, like anyone, you can. And right now in the world, I mean, from COVID to climate change to war to political disruption to algorithms, et cetera, change is a constant in a way that it has never felt before. I think there's disruption is the norm in a certain way. And so with that comes a heightened need, a commensurate need then to be able to have the kind of conversation within the kind of relationship that allows space for me to say the wrong thing. And I think about the political, like the context of politics, or the topic of politics in conversation as an example, and how we're sorted into silos by algorithms online increasingly, so that we're shunted over to be only with the people that someone else or some AI has decided we agree with. And that's a bad recipe for society, because it makes it more difficult for people to have conversations with people they disagree with, because they're less and less accustomed to being in conversation with people they disagree with.
Mm.
And so then this whole like expectation of saying the right thing is heightened, because we're only with people who say the right thing, who don't challenge us with the resistance of a differing opinion. And in the context of democracy in ancient Greece, that was the beginning of the slippery slope of stasis into civil war and return to oligarchy from democracy. And so, but we all have the capacity to be walking in the opposite direction from that through each conversation that we have, in each relationship that we have. And it consists of just what we're talking about here, just what I feel like each of us has described in our own way, what the conversations on these episodes have felt like to be a part of. And then maybe from a stepping back and looking at it from more of a meta perspective, seeing that as well.
Very well articulated.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was thinking as well, like when we're in those silos that you talk about, like the conversations that we are then thinking we need to have, or that we are having, are about the things that, like, you jump straight to those divisive points of the conversation as well, as opposed to, again, taking the model of these 5 conversations. They're human conversations. You're talking about, you're connecting at a human to human level. You might then touch on things that you disagree on. You might go deep into those things, and you might have a real back and forth around those things. But ultimately it's on a foundation of compassion, of human to human, of like humanizing one another. And that's such an important thing that is missing in so much of the kind of algorithmic society that we're building. It's such a really good point.
Mm.
Yeah, it really is. I think to that the the algorithms don't really invite Tankespjärn at all. And I think what these conversations do to a great extent is just that, invite Tankespjärn. Especially since you're having 5 conversations, Elena, you're having 5 conversations with in this case 6 different people, doing the bumblebee thing with cross-pollinating, becoming that algorithm yourself.
Mm.
Just not saying, hey, you're all gonna be thinking exactly like me. That's why you're on the podcast, but rather saying, okay, here are people from all over. Some I don't even know what they do for a living, you know. Let's see what kind of tankespjärn we can get out of that. I would like us to sort of move, sort of my just to be transparent here. My thought is that for us to talk about the before the conversations, the during conversations, and the after the conversations. So sort of moving. You've all been touching on this before. But sort of what do you bring with you from these conversations? What are some, I don't know, practices, thoughts, ideas, feelings that you bring with you from these conversations out into either other conversations that you're gonna have or have had, or in life in general?
No, I think for me, I did tremendously enjoy the conversations because I do like having this sort of conversations. I just generally love it. And finding another human being, a group of people, as we do today, with whom we can share those thoughts and like talk on different topics and mention how important are the conversation, this type of conversations. It's really important for me. So I think I was grateful for this opportunity. Like each time we finished, I was able to think about the things that we spoke. I was able to think about this a little bit more, give some more thoughts to it. This sparked some other thoughts and things that I implemented in further to my life, workflow, and things, similar things. But I think what it uh, not reminds me, but it emphasizes to me that the conversation is an important part of our lives, and we need to learn to have those conversations in the way that encourages the thinking process, the diving deep into a topic. Because each conversations that we had with Helena, we talked about different things, but we looked to the things from different angles, from different directions. And I think that's really amazing because we often just see things from one perspective. We look to it as like, oh, okay, it has to be all like this, all like that. And there is nothing in between. And I think that's incorrect. And the thing in between is the honest, deep conversation that we are brave to have because, like, as Matthew said, we're going to be wrong. And it's okay to be wrong because otherwise we wouldn't understand anything, we wouldn't learn anything. And so it reminds me to just have those conversations, to put time in it, to not forget that they are important, and to be brave to have them also. With people sometimes I'm not comfortable having the conversation with. So yeah, I think that's for me like the main aspect and for afterwards.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that totally. And yeah, as I said, the kind of creative sparks that flew as a result of conversations as well was a big thing for me. And yeah, stimulating conversations with myself. You know, Helena, you mentioned that earlier, like that ongoing conversation that, and Matthew as well, that kind of sense of having a conversation and also inviting a bit of grace into that conversation in terms of allowing things to be wrong. And say wrong in inverted commas, because it's almost like, what does wrong even mean? But like, just, yeah, being able to, you know, we've talked about shock absorbers. You talked about laughter as a shock absorber in our last conversation, which was something that really then went on and stimulated a blog post. But yeah, just allowing things to bounce. And for me, like, it's something I'm doing a lot in my work at the moment, is going back. You know, I've blogged and I've had my podcast for over 10 years. So I'm at the moment going back into early episodes, because I don't want to just delete the archive, but I'm also very aware that I think very differently to how I did back then. And there's some things which, you know, I'm like, could I get cancelled for that? What's, you know, what's in there? So I'm kind of, and it's a really nice process, just going back and picking apart old episodes. And I'm kind of creating a tapestry style podcast now. Like, I'm just about to start releasing it around certain topics which I've touched on before, and just having that conversation with my past self and allowing myself to evolve my thinking and grow in terms of, through the lens of today. Okay, yeah, what did I say about that? That's kind of weird. And just, I suppose it's something good for myself, but it's also something that I'm very aware I want to model, because the idea of, you know, like, I think we're so quick to judge other people on things that have been said in the past and things. And, you know, often there's sort of reasons for that, good reasons for that. But we need to all give ourselves and one another more grace in that. And so it's again coming up with the practices to do that. And I think, yeah, reflecting on conversations afterwards of these 5 conversations, there's been a few occasions where I'm thinking, yeah, I said that, but I'm not sure I agree in any way whatsoever with what I said. And it's kind of what you do with that thought is quite interesting. A lot of the time it's just, okay, maybe I'll journal about it and come to a place of like, yeah, no, I think that's where I'll settle on that. Sometimes you might need to go back and actually address it and be like, you know, I said that last time. Yeah, I'm not sure I think that actually. And then other times it's just, yeah, just let it be, because that's a part of, you know, the safety to be wrong, or the safety to say things that we don't even, you know, often you say things you don't mean. Like, that's just the nature of clumsiness of language, the clumsiness of yeah, working out what you think about things. It's like, yeah, you're not going to come out with really crystal clear, perfect points every single time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you bringing grace into this conversation, because I think we're naming it, because maybe it's already been here. But for me, there's been a sort of trajectory around visibility that has been both public and private, and at essentially at the interface of those two, and that I have been becoming visible on the internet, in that you didn't used to be able to really, you know, turn me up with a Google search. And in part because there are a lot of Matthew Baines around, like a lot, and a lot of them are well known, even sports people and stuff. And And so I was always just Matthew Bain until the past couple of years when I started putting my middle name in, becoming Matthew Word Bain, of which there are very few. In fact, perhaps only one. And so that was a step that as I chose to use that additional name, I became increasingly self-conscious of then this translates into a certain potential visibility, and then beginning to appear on a podcast or 2 or 5 or 6, then of course there's a visibility that comes with that, or audibility, but also visibility certainly. And what's happened is that along the same timeline, I've been going through a process of um, along the lines of inner work, becoming aware of um, visibility as the frame, a more useful frame for what's happening to myself at this time in my life than a previous frame that I had been using. And so I can maybe articulate that plainly by saying that I had been thinking that I didn't have a persona in the world, and that there was a part of this conversation about personas, and saying that people don't I feel as though people have never known how to relate to me because I didn't have like a ready-made persona for them to interact with. And that instead I was just a blank screen. And then someone very helpfully and disruptively, in a good way, asked the question, well, what if the blank screen was your persona? And that then connected to a metaphor that came up for me in the context of trauma work over the past 10 years, and um, became suddenly clear that that indeed was the nature of things. And so I've been in the process of stepping out from behind this persona of a blank screen and thus becoming visible. And so that's happening for me with myself, with personal relationships in, geographical space where I live, with people I actually see in person, and of course with people online, which is mostly who I interact with socially these days. And so, I can't really separate those two processes out. In fact, I've been discovering, it's been this sort of toggling back and forth of discovery in both of those related contexts, um, and in conversation. And so, in being able to, in enjoying relationships which afford me this grace of being able to be wrong. And I think about, actually, and I was thinking at first of the term grace note, and Andy, maybe you can correct me. I'm not sure I'm using that term correctly, because now I'm not sure if this is actually what a grace note is, but a passing note, at least in music, can be when you're headed for the E, but you play the E flat on your way in. It's this sort of inflection. And what is that but playing a wrong note on the way to getting to the right note? And that's actually done intentionally in music. Not always, but it can be. And it's a way of adding character, texture, flavor, whatever. But it's an interesting metaphor for, I think, what we're talking about in terms of um, holding open the space for playing the wrong note on your way to the right note, which is, I think, what we're talking about in terms of holding a nurturing space in conversation / relationship for people to find out what they believe, how they make meaning by speaking in conversation, and getting to a clearer understanding of what that is, by finding some dead ends along the way, essentially. And so I've then, in terms of more directly in response to your question, Caspian, I've actually been um, really interested in how uh, how I can participate in more conversations like this, and also with new people. And so it's wonderful for me today to be here in conversation with Caspian, I've interacted with you a few times, but as part of a larger group. And Izzy, we've had some conversations in a text forum context. And Andy, I've heard your podcast a little bit in your episodes with Helena, but this is my first time, of course, being with you in person. And so the newness, the novelty of these interactions is really precious to me. And I have been, I don't have a lot to reveal in terms of specifics, but there's, and it's not necessarily been caused by this, but there's been a concomitant arising of the process of developing a podcast that I will be hosting, one of the hosts for, that is very much about emergent conversation. It's about specifically intended to create a space for to find out what wants to happen in the form of conversation, and that will initially probably not be something with guests, but that ideally long term, I think the desire is for bringing other people into that, and then it starts to be about both relationship and new people and the sort of networking. And I don't mean that in a marketing sense, but like a mycelial sense, that this is about growing human connection, allowing human connection to emerge and converge, and finding out what happens when you bring together people from disparate backgrounds and disparate professions and disparate viewpoints to have a conversation together, which of course is that's what we're doing today. That's what Tankespjärn, the podcast, has been, um, i- i- in a more granular way, and then it becomes more coherent in that sense in these group calls. Um, but I'm very interested in that because I think that's a way of bringing intention to what we're talking about in terms of holding space for people and allowing people to say the wrong thing and all of that. Um, but to actively seek out, which is what, of course, I see you doing, Helena, in terms of finding guests for Tankespjärn, um, and wanting to experience more of that for myself. And so it's been exciting to just to watch it unfold. It's clear. It seems clearly like that's something that wants to happen, and that wants, you know, me to participate in its unfolding. So
Lovely. It's lovely. And I was, the last group conversation we had with Steve and Inma Reddy, it kind of really brought the message home to me that, yeah, there really is a place for this type of conversation. There is value to this type of conversation. This is an offering that holds a lot of value to me, that I knew. It does hold a lot of value to each of you individually. And I knew that from season 1, but it was like hammered home more now in these group conversations, but also from the some of the feedback that I've been getting from people who listen, that they are so enjoying being a part of the conversation, because that's kind of what I hear people who comment on it saying, that, oh yeah, I wanted to jump in and talk to you about languages, or it's like, so that it is like, yeah, we are recording and then it will be released a couple of weeks afterward, but that there's some type of opening to this, that it doesn't feel like it's closing in, or I don't know, putting up a barrier. It's rather the opposite. It's like, here's an opening And you're welcome to join in any way you see fit. If it is, interaction, or if it is just feeling that you're a part of the conversation, that feeling is important. That one gives me even more incitament, we say in Swedish. Well, I don't know. It gives me energy, or like fuel to keep at it, to do this, because I see that there is value in it.
Mm.
That's what I love about the podcast format is it's an invitation. Like it always feels like you're involved in you feel closer to the people that you're listening to than you obviously are, but you feel involved and you feel invited into that conversation when it's at its best. As opposed to it being like a broadcast of we're relaying a load of information, you're listening and soaking that in. Obviously there are podcasts like that. But I think what you're doing with Tankespjärn is what I love about the podcast format, which is that it's just this organic, no limits thing that can reach everybody around the world. I think we've done well. Money always does it, like in terms of constraining the format and plastering adverts over things and stuff like that. But like, yeah, I think I just really appreciate that we have very similar values when it comes to the podcast medium. So I think you just nail it. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's a really nice note to end on as well for today and for this whole season. That is. Thank you all for showing up and for having had these conversations with Helena. It's been a joy having this conversation today, but also editing all of them.
Thank
So
you.
thank you.
Yeah, it's been
Thank you.
amazing. I've
was
really
lovely
enjoyed
to
this
meet
today
you.
as well. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
lovely to meet everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. You're welcome and thank you.
Yeah. Luckily, I will see you around.